Thank you for joining us at one of our 2021 Reed Fink Award and Southern Labor History Talks. This award honors Dr. Merle E. Reed and Dr. Gary Fink for their contributions to education, labor studies, and the Southern Labor Archives. Fellowships of at least $250 are awarded annually to individuals whose research in the Southern Labor Archives will lead to a book, article, dissertation, or another product. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to remind you to please email your questions to archives@gsu.edu, and I will make sure to ask them at the end of the presentation. Eshe Shirley is a PhD candidate in history and a certificate student in women's and gender studies at the University of Michigan. Her dissertation project explores how Black women organized around waged and unwaged care work in the late 20th century Atlanta. She holds an MA in history from the University of Michigan and a BA in African American Studies from Yale University. Eshe's talk is titled Household Technicians or Maids of Honor, the National Domestic Workers Union and Black Women's Political Power in the 1970s Atlanta. All right, Eshe, take it away.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Lisa. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully without incident. And okay. So before I get started, like Lisa said, my name is Eshe, and I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Michigan. And I just want to start with a quick thank you, of course, to Lisa for coordinating my visit and answering my many, many questions over email, to the Reed Fink Award Committee, and to everyone taking some time this afternoon to listen to my talk. I'm looking forward to your questions at the end. In the spirit of the Reed Fink Award, which offers resources for people to come and use the Southern Labor Archives, I wanted to take a moment before I got into the sort of meat of my talk, to tell a brief story about how I first encountered the Southern Labor Archives, Dorothy Bolden, and the National Domestic Workers Union. Now, over 5 years ago, which feels like a lifetime ago, I was an undergraduate student taking a seminar on the history of the U.S. South. The professor for the class, the brilliant and amazing Southern historian Glenna Gilmore, had asked each of us to write a narrative history on some topic about Southern history. And because at the time I was a urban studies concentrator, I chose to write about the development of MARTA in the Atlanta metropolitan area. So through my research on Marta, I learned about Dorothy Bolden and all these juicy quotes in the newspaper archives about her trying to make sure that Marta was developed in a way that really served working class and poor Black Atlantans. And upon digging just a little bit further, I discovered the Southern Labor Archives collection on the National Domestic Workers Union. Um, and I was blown away. I became fascinated with Bolden, with the NDWU, um, and just with her story more broadly. Um, but there was another part of the collection I encountered that was not about Marta, and it was about Maids Day. And I remember thinking, as an undergraduate student, like Maids Honor Day, I see the value of that. We're recognizing the work that these women have done, but this is not the exciting civil rights movement story I thought I was going to tell. I thought Maids Day was perhaps the most boring thing I'd ever seen as an undergraduate student. I was like, ah, I'll just put these folders to the side. I'm gonna stick with the Marta story. But a few years later, as a graduate student, I returned back to the Southern Labor Archives and the National Domestic Workers Union records in search of something to help me write a paper or start a dissertation project. And I saw those Maids Day archives again, and I realized my mistake that in fact, Maids Honor Day is part of this. Um, Fascinating story about the changing nature of domestic work in Atlanta and the South in the late 20th century, about race relations in the city of Atlanta, and about the brilliant political organizing of the National Domestic Workers Union. Um, And so my return back to the Southern Labor Archives years later as a graduate student became the foundation for the dissertation that I'm working on now. Um, just going to, let's see. So that broader dissertation is called Care in Crisis, like Lisa said, Black Women and the Politics of Labor in Atlanta from 1965 to 1968, or sorry, 1965 to 1985, sorry, um, and which explores organizing around domestic work in conversation with other kinds of paid and unpaid care work. Black women struggled around in this period, including welfare rights, domestic labor in prisons, home health care, and housing activism. My research so far, which I'm in the beginning stages of, suggests that working class Black women in Atlanta, which was a historic center of both civil rights movement activism, of course, but also of um, domestic labor and service work, that they developed a Black feminist vision out of their organizing that challenged the devaluation of care work and understood care as central to the project of Black freedom. And of course, one of the key thinkers in that Black feminist project was Dorothy Bolden, but the dissertation hopes to think about her in relationship to other Black women who are doing this kind of work in Atlanta, like Ethel May Matthews, who's in this photo to the right with some of her paintings. I love this photo of her. She was a noted welfare rights activist in Atlanta, and people like Susie Laborde, who's in the photo to the left, telling a city council member what's what. Um, she was the first public housing um, uh, person who lived in public housing who was on the Atlanta Housing Authority board in the early 70s. And so see, these are some of the other women whose work that the dissertation hopes to explore and think about their work in relationship to each other rather than separate from one another. So kind of getting into this talk specifically, um, I want to focus on how I've gone about beginning to answer the question that caused me to initially dismiss Maids Honor Day as an undergraduate. Why would a savvy group of Black women activists employ stereotypes of domestic service by hosting a Maids Honor Day? Um, when in this period, the domestic worker movement nationally, and certainly the National Domestic Workers Union in Atlanta, was very intentionally employing language to push back against this idea and image of the Black maid. Um, and as I learned more about that national movement, um, this choice to call it Maids Honor Day became even more perplexing to me. Um, as these workers started to advance this language of household technicians in the 1960s in order to highlight the professionalism and skill involved in domestic labor against this kind of naturalized image of Black women in service. Um, so in this talk, I want to suggest that while Maids Honor Day revealed the continued racism of white Southern employers, the National Domestic Workers Union understood how to mobilize the intimacies that developed from their labor in these employers' homes in their own interests. They also used Maids Honor Day to present domestic workers as an important electoral constituency that needed to be courted by both rising Black politicians and important white political players. And so I just want to note here briefly that Maids Honor Day was happening in a particular moment in Atlanta political history where the city was undergoing a transition from a city that was run by a kind of unequal biracial coalition of white and Black men to a period when in 1973 Maynard Jackson becomes the first Black mayor of Atlanta. And so this talk is kind of in that transition period between 1968, which is also when the union was founded, to around 1973, where the kind of world of race and politics in Atlanta was in an important stage of flux. So a little bit on what Maid's Day was. This picture on the left is of one of the winners of Maid's Day with the family who nominated her. So Maids Honor Day was an event held yearly by the National Domestic Workers Union to publicly recognize the excellent work by domestic workers in Atlanta, and they held it from around 1970 to 1979. As part of the process of choosing the Maid of the Year, the NDWU asked employers to submit nominations, which they also called entry blanks. And you can see an example of one here where there's a kind of preamble at the top, a date the employer should get the nomination in by, and then a space where they can write in their nomination. And some of these went on for quite a while. This is a shorter one. Um, and so in these nominations, they asked employers to explain why the domestic worker that they had hired should be made of the year. The nomination form had instructions for the employer and then a template for them to fill in, like I said, explaining why um, they should be chosen. The instructions read in part, quote, all maids will be recognized in Atlanta on this day for the special and faithful service they have given over the months and years. Special attention will be paid to those maids who have provided service to a family or members of the same family for 30 years or more, end quote. So through that invocation of the, special nature of domestic work and the particular value of service to one family over many decades, the NDWU almost invited employers to honor domestic workers for the kind of stereotypical qualities that the union actually was combating. Um, Once the nominations were collected, a committee made up of notable Atlantans decided on a first, second, and third place winner, and then there was also a fourth special award that was often given. Um, in 1970, the committee included State Representative and SNCC veteran Ben Brown, his wife Lydia, Mary Lou Mitchell, a news clerk for the Atlanta Bureau of the New York Times, um, a former Atlanta Urban League president and Georgia House Representative Grace Towns Hamilton, and in later years, both Lillian and Judy Carter and the former governor and Senator Herman Talmadge's wife Betty Talmadge would serve on the committee. Um, and then on the evening of the event, Black and white politicians, domestic workers, and their guests would gather at a hotel and have a beautiful fancy dinner to honor the work of Atlanta's domestic workers. So this talk is not just going to focus in on Maids Day, but it's going to use these employer nominations to explore how the NDWU attempted to intervene in the racialized and gendered labor relationships between predominantly white women employers and Black domestic workers in Atlanta. On the one hand, the employer nominations reveal the endurance of racial stereotypes that have plagued Black women doing this kind of work since chattel slavery. But on the other hand, the 1970s saw both the marketplace for care provision and the place of women in the workforce change drastically. And so the NDWU used May's Honor Day to navigate this complex terrain and build political power for poor and working class Black women in Atlanta. Um, let's talk a little bit about these nominations. So, one of the main themes that shows up in the nominations is the idea of domestic workers as part of a family, which is something many of us would be familiar with if we've learned something about domestic work, the history of domestic work. Um, so one example of this, one of my favorites from the nominations in 1970 is one that a child wrote in, where you can see she created a little image of the domestic worker, Ms. Reese, who she wanted to nominate, and she wrote, quote, "Dear friends, honor Ella because she is nice and gentle. I like to talk to her because of her sweet voice. She comes here at 8 and leaves at 3. She sits only once for lunch. Ella is our friend," from Mary Hamilton. And so you can see in this nomination from a child that from a young age, young white Southerners are learning this kind of tension between honoring Ella Reese because she is excellent at her job. She's nice, she's gentle, she's fun to talk to, but also because she denies herself breaks. She only sits once just to eat lunch. And even at this young age, this child of an employer has learned to call her by her first name. We see in this other nomination from Mrs. Duffy, quote, "I believe Marie should be honored on Maids Day because she has been a true and faithful friend in my family for 22 years. I feel that I am honored and blessed that she has given so many years to making my family comfortable and extremely happy. I want to thank the committee for proclaiming a special day to recognize my loyal maid." Um, which the use of the possessive there always sticks out to me in the end of that last sentence, my loyal maid. But also that sentiment that comes up throughout these nominations that employers are excited to have an opportunity to talk about the kind of impact that these domestic workers, the positive impact that they had on their life. As Mrs. Fuller said in this other nomination, quote, I believe Mrs. Eloise Rutledge should be honored on Maids Day because of her long and faithful service, so mirroring the nomination form at the top, and friendship to me and all my family. She has helped me raise my three sons for 16 years. She has been my rock of Gibraltar through all my troubles and joys. She is not my maid, but my dearest friend, which is a really telling construction there. Not maid, actually friend. And so, as Premilla Nadasen argues in her book, Household Workers Unite, um, which is on the National Domestic Workers Movement and it has great material in it on the NDW specifically. She says, quote, this is a longer quote, characterizing domestic workers as family enabled employers to flout the law and create informal and unpredictable work situations. It's an inconsistency that remains present today. Employers entrust their home and their children to another individual. And in order for that situation to be viable, they have to believe that care and love were central components of the occupation. In contrast, household workers in the 1970s rarely used the framework of care to talk about their work. They preferred a labor construct over a care construct, a focus on rights rather than emotion. They knew that employers, for all their talk of familiarity, insisted on difference. They maintained a strict separation between family members and women working in their homes in order to justify an equal treatment. End quote. So the National Domestic Workers Union solicitation of nominations, which they knew would include these tropes, and their invocations or suggestions of these tropes on the form kind of complicate the story that Madison is telling us. As Alice Adams, a National Domestic Worker Union member and organizer, and a domestic worker for decades, told one interviewer, quote, domestic work is one of the most intelligent jobs that you could have. It's very important. It's necessary. You're supposed to be intelligent, and I was intelligent, and I worked with intelligent, Christian, good people, but it was low pay. End quote. Bolden concurred in many of the interviews done with her, talking about how she loved taking care of children and enjoyed the aspects of care that shaped her time in domestic work, but that her complaint was about the unequal power relationships between employers and domestic workers, how those were racialized, and the low pay and bad working conditions that fellow domestic workers had to endure. So rather than divorce domestic labor from the aspects of care work, some members, not certainly not all, but some genuinely enjoyed, the NDWU tried to reframe those dynamics using the act of asking employers to write these nominations as an opportunity to get them to see that the kind of care intensive labor done by employees should be acknowledged by higher pay and public recognition. These entry blanks or nominations also hint at how wider shifts in the economy were beginning to shift the dynamics of domestic labor relations. In the previous slide, one of the things I've started to notice is that while we usually talk about part of the family as being the kind of framework that employers use to talk about domestic workers, the language of friendship was is really prominent in these nominations, and I think some of that might have been shaped by women employers starting to work themselves. The union did a survey of their employers and found most of them were couples where the husband had a very high paying job and the woman stayed home. But you can start to see in these nominations that that starts to shift a little bit, where more of the women who are employers of domestic workers are working themselves and are not staying home to directly supervise domestic workers as they're doing their jobs. And that changes the kind of tenor of the labor relationship that's happening. Um, So you can see in this nomination from Mrs. Harmer, quote, I believe Mary Cook should be honored on Maid's Day because although she is a perfect maid, she is much more than that to our family. She's a stand-in mother to my babies while I work, giving them all the love, discipline, care, teaching, and fun they need. Furthermore, she's a friend and ally for me, helping me in many small and large ways, a rare understanding woman who is both adaptable and reliable. I can tell by my own children what good care they receive from her, and her own 9 children are a wonderful testimony to the kind of mother that she is. So we can see in this one how the work that Mrs. Cook is doing is allowing Mrs. Harmer to do the kind of labor that she needs to do outside of the home. And I think that that's part of why Mrs. Cook is kind of framed as an ally here, specifically to the woman in the household rather than a part of the larger family, which is, I think, an important kind of shift. You can also see that in this nomination from Mrs. Sellen, where she says, I believe Virginia Hurd Johnson should be honored on Maids Day because she's a fine person who is utterly reliable. I also work, and in 2 years, she has only missed one day because she cares about her job. I am able to teach young children much better. That way, we work together to help many people. So you see a similar kind of framing in this one where these she frames them as two women working together in order to achieve compatible goals. Now we know the reality of that was a lot more complicated, that these are women coming from very different social positions that are unequal and that that's shaping the way that this labor is happening. Um, but it's a very different way of talking about the role of domestic workers in the lives of these white Southern women than I've seen before. And I think feels more similar to the way that people talk about the folks that do care work for them now. Like they are helping me to um, be able to achieve some of this labor that I need to do for like an elder parent for a child so that I can go out and do wage labor. Notable here also is how evaluating the way domestic workers mother their own children becomes a way for employers to evaluate their fitness as workers, which is another thread I've seen throughout these nominations. Um, but that I just wanted to note here because it comes up in both of these that I'm still working through. So, one of the other goals of May's Day was to change the way domestic workers thought about themselves by recognizing their achievements both on the job but also off of it. As Bolden once recalled in relation to part one of May's Day, which happened in local churches, she said, quote, the minister in my church asked all the maids to stand up. No one did. I know many of the women sitting there were maids because I rode the bus with them. They didn't feel that they had respectable jobs, and they were ashamed to admit they were maids, end quote. So even as domestic workers joined the union and fought for better treatment, they still internalized some of the devaluation of domestic work. So while Maids Honor Day was mobilized by Bolden and the union in order to achieve a variety of political effects, perhaps the most important was the empowerment of the membership. Although Bolden herself was clearly a unique and charismatic leader, she understood, as well as any organizer, that power comes from a base that feels like it deserves better and has the tools to fight for a shift in the status quo. And so Maids Honor Day was a citywide, almost performative act that pulled many stakeholders, Black middle class men, white women employers, their husbands, and domestic workers themselves um, in and demanded a shift in how these actors related to each other, with domestic workers receiving more respect from all these different worlds of actors. So while it's unlikely that Maids Honor Day could fundamentally disrupt, many hundreds of years of degrading acts and expectations of Black women doing this kind of service work, it could enact kind of symbolic interventions at several kind of key moments that could have lasting effects on the membership's conception of themselves. And so the first piece of this, which I'm not going to talk that much about today, that I've been doing some research on is that Bolden, in the lead up to Maids Honor Day, was in the press making the argument we're having Maids Honor Day because domestic workers are indispensable and everyone should understand that. Um, And so there's a kind of rhetorical um, work that she's doing to help people in the wider community see the value of the work that these women are doing. And some of that also included profiling some of the winners of Maids Honor Day um, in like the Atlanta Constitution. The second kind of moment is the more interpersonal act of domestic workers asking employers to fill out the nomination, bringing the nomination to work and saying, you're going to fill, can you fill this out? Um, and that kind of ask is fits really neatly into one of the key tactics of the union, which was to teach domestic workers how to negotiate one-on-one with employers in order to get those higher benefits um, and pay. And so you can kind of see from the perspective of an organizer trying to help women to learn how to feel empowered enough to have that one-on-one conversation with their employer, that an ask like this, hey, ask your employer to fill out this form, is a kind of part of that kind of leadership development for membership to learn how to do that kind of negotiation on the job because they weren't able to bargain collectively. And of course, the last piece of this is on the day itself, where domestic workers are honored and recognized publicly for their work. And so, one of the interesting things about these nominations is that the impact of this work that the union is doing, it shows up in them. As employers start to recognize the work that domestic workers are doing, yes, in their homes, but also out in their communities in a way that's pretty extraordinary. Mrs. Thelenius writes in one of these nominations, quote, I believe Pearl should be honored on Maids Day because she's an outstanding person and a good friend. She's a scout leader for 36 girls. She's a den mother for 23 scouts. She's a supervisor for 200 children in the church. She teaches Sunday school. She's the president of the Willing Workers Board. She has no children of her own. She's a devoted nurse to my children. She's honest, hardworking, and loyal, and she can talk baseball. Um, but you can see that Mrs. Thelenius is able to recognize the kind of leadership that Ms. White has shown outside of the confines of her own home. You can see a similar dynamic in this nomination from Mrs. Oxford, where she says, quote, I believe that Luella Terrell should be honored on Maids Day because she's a person of character and integrity, an interested citizen participating in community affairs as well as a conscientious employee. She has served as PTA president Cooper Street and is now vice president of Hoke Smith PTA. She served as block warden for the Atlanta Negro Voters League. Luella has 6 children and was den mother for her son's Boy Scout troop and Girl Scout leader. She was elected Great Mother of the Year 3 different times. Her children are all currently engaged in worthwhile pursuit, and she lists all the incredible things that Terrell's children are doing. And one of the things that really just stuck out to me about this nomination is that this employer sees the value of Terrell's voting rights activism, which, I mean, it's hard to imagine that an employer would write explicitly about saying, oh, look at, this domestic workers' leadership in the area of voting rights before, 1970. Even in 1970, it's pretty extraordinary. And I think that some of that is about the work that the union did to help employers to see the value of the kind of labor and leadership that these women were showing. Okay, so on the day of the event, employers who had nominated domestic workers, NDWU members, and both rising and established stars of the Black political elite would gather to honor 4 Black women who had done decades of domestic service. While this was a day to celebrate the achievements of these women, it was also a day for politicking. Bolden insisted that all National Domestic Workers Union members be registered to vote. And so Maids Day wasn't just an audience of Atlantans, but also an audience of voters. Bolden used Maids Honor Day to introduce emerging Black politicians to constituents and to solidify her relationships with labor leaders like Yale Abercrombie and political families like the Carters. You can see in this photo, I'm pretty sure this is the day that Maids Honor Day became a state holiday. And you could see Bolden with left with Jimmy Carter on the right and other members of the union in the middle. Um, and Bolden had a very close relationship to Carter's mother. that an event like Maids Day just further helped to solidify. Um, and so Maids Honor Day also shone a light onto the complexities of race and class in Atlanta politics during this time. So Maynard Jackson actually articulated his take on the dynamics of Maids Honor Day as a tension between white Atlantans' professed liberalism and the reality of the way they related to Black people, which was premised on control. So looking back at Maids Honor Day, he opined, quote, "You had white families here who really felt a sense of injustice coming from the system, and there was a kind of Calvary to them. And they helped make Atlanta a great city too, part of the early days of the Progressive Coalition, which is multiracial. So you got this schizophrenic relationship when in fact they really believe they love this person, but on the other hand, they never stop to think about the economic oppression that they were causing this person," end quote. So Jackson is pointing to the messiness of how white Atlantans understood the connection between the Black people that they employed and the Black politicians and constituents that they negotiated with out in the public sphere. On the one hand, Maids Honor Day gave white Atlantans the chance to feel like that cavalry, saving, these domestic workers, recognizing them out of the goodness of their hearts. And this aspect of Maids Day bolstered white Atlantans' belief that they were good white partners in the Progressive Coalition, saving individual Black people in their lives and participating in the multiracial coalition that Jackson is talking about, that marked Atlanta as modern and urbane, especially in this early 70s period. On the other hand, as he says, they never stopped to think about the economic oppression they were causing. And so, in order to secure their understanding of themselves as these good liberal partners, white Atlantans who participated in the Progressive Coalition had to suppress their recognition of the reality that they were also a central part of the problem. However, this schizophrenia, as Jackson called it, of white Atlantan self conception was also a political opening for the NDW and their allies. And I think it really speaks to their acumen that they were able to see this as an opening rather than just a really frustrating, hypocritical state of affairs. So, as Bolden argued in the Atlanta Journal Constitution, or I guess just the Atlanta Constitution at that time, quote, everybody who has a maid has a poverty stricken person working for them. The first thing they tell you when you arrive in your apron is they're going to a meeting to help the poor. They should start right at home, end quote. This clear hypocrisy allowed the NDWU to use Maids Honor Day to simultaneously challenge employers to put their money where their mouth was, while reassuring them at the same time that the loving feelings they had for employees was real, legitimate, and a desired way for employers to show domestic workers respect. This approach wasn't able to uproot the ways that narratives of family and mutual love and affection undergirded the exploitation that was happening in these employers' homes, but they did provide a wedge through which the union could demand better from employers, and they were very successful in doing that. Members of the union made significantly more than domestic workers or people doing house cleaning. Either at other companies or through services or individually. It was also it's also a really good example of the kind of approach that Bolden had to the union's politics. One of the things she often said, which is really true, is that people who are still doing domestic work in individual households by the early 1970s really were locked out of many of other different kinds of employment as different kinds of work opened up for Black women in this period. The folks still doing domestic work were doing it because they needed to do it. And so she was always very careful, and the union was very careful to develop tactics that were able to move the agenda of the union forward to empower the membership to get those increases in pay and those better working conditions, but to do it without being overly confrontational. And so this approach to Maids Honor Day is very much within that larger strategy or kind of tightrope that Bolden was walking. So, through its careful construction, Maids Honor Day was able to give the impression that everybody got what they wanted. The black politicians got to come and, talk to their constituents and um, shore up their public personas. Employers got to feel like they had done a good thing and supported the union. Domestic workers got publicly recognized, and the union was able to bring all of these different stakeholders together to kind of solidify different parts of its base of political power. Um, but even though the day gave that impression, um, the discomfort, like that expressed by Jackson, still kind of swirled under the surface. So that's all I have for you today. I'm looking forward to your questions. Um, and thank you.
Thank you so much. This was such a great presentation. I've always thought the Maids Honor Day kind of nomination forms are such a rich resource and are really ripe for study. And so I'm so happy to see you using them in such a great way.
Yeah, they're sort of that's part of what makes them fun to look at, but there's also so many of them. So I don't know why people haven't fully gone through all of them yet because they are so rich. They're also numerous. So
Yes, we do have a lot, which I think it is great. And yeah, some of them are really lengthy. And they're such an interesting kind of juxtaposition that you've been exploring. So yeah, okay, let's dive into some questions. If any of you watching have a question you would like to ask, please email archives@gsu.edu and I will make sure to ask your question. So to start off with, how does your presentation fit into your broader research project?
yeah, so there are kind of two different answers to that. So the first is that, when I first started thinking about this dissertation project, it was organized almost kind of by a political organizer and then the work that they were doing. So there was going to be a chapter on Dorothy Bolden and the union. There was going to be a chapter on Ethel May Matthews and welfare rights work. There was going to be a housing chapter, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I quickly realized that all of those could be dissertations, and I needed to find a way to integrate them. But the kind of first answer is that it's um, one of the main domestic work is one of the main areas where Black women are organizing around kind of caring labor in this period. And it's also an area where you can see the way that the market for care provision shifts in the late 20th century from this kind of old school individual women Black women working in individual homes, to the state getting involved in some interesting ways, like the development of home health care, which a lot of domestic workers go into later on in the 20th century. The second answer to the question is that in order to kind of deal with that problem of all these women being way too interesting and there being way too much to say, um, I've kind of developed a new approach where the first chapter of my dissertation is really going to think about um, the kind of political bases that women like Bolden built that had a real impact on how Black political power emerged in Atlanta more broadly. And so Maids Day is just one really great example of both the base building that happened in the Union, but then also how it was being translated into a broader kind of political power. And while people have, I mean, most people who know Atlanta political history know all the women that I've mentioned, know that they individually had important voices, but I think sometimes what gets downplayed about their contributions is that they developed these relationships with larger groups of Black women very intentionally to kind of influence the politics that were happening. So this smaller section is a part of a broader chapter that thinks about that.
Okay. We have a question from Valerie. Do you see parallels between your research time period, 1965 to 1985, and today? So back then there was the civil rights movement, which was obviously very impactful for the National Domestic Workers Union. And today we have Black Lives Matter and a new wave of feminism with like hashtag Me Too. Are there lessons here that the current National Domestic Workers Alliance could benefit from?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's one of the most exciting pieces of this project that it does feel very current. Um, in some ways for not great reasons that we still don't value care work and the women, mostly women who do it in the way that we should. But I think one of the key lessons from the kind of work that I'm doing on this in the sort of late 20th century period, and I think the National Domestic Workers Alliance already knows this because this is what they're saying, which is that we should listen to the workers, and that they have a powerful political analysis that has a long history that doesn't just go back to the early 1970s, but goes back way further, that we should all look to as a way to think about what a vision of a caring infrastructure would be that serves all of us. And I think that's really what I hear. Um, Current people organizing around this saying. I think the other piece that I see my work as a kind of prehistory for um, is that people doing care work in particular are kind of seen as victims of the way the economy changed in the late 20th century, and they were. But they were also people thinking really hard about what a new structure would need to look like so that everyone could get their needs met, and trying to navigate um, the way that care got newly commodified in this period. And so I think that that's, again, a piece that you see coming up again today, where it is domestic workers who are fighting for legislation for really concrete shifts to the way that the state offers resources around this kind of work. And so I think domestic workers then and now don't get enough credit for thinking in really sophisticated and important ways about state structure and the economy. I mean, these are women who are actually experts on how capitalism works and how it makes care more challenging. So I think that's a lesson from the past that we also see coming up today.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So we have a question from Robert. Was there opposition among whites towards the union? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. There was absolutely opposition from whites. One of the things that first drew me to Bolden was the way that she responded to that opposition. I mean, there's stories of people calling her house of the Klan, harassing her. So there was absolutely a kind of white vigilante, at least threat to the Union and to Bolden herself. Um, a lot of the opposition, though, was kind of covered by this language of family, which is why I sort of find it so extraordinary that the union tried to mobilize that to get what they wanted. Because, I was recently listening to an oral history by Alice Adams, one of the women I quoted in the talk, and she talked about, she's like, I got along great with my employer, but she wouldn't pay me more if I, if I begged her, if I tried to make her, and so there's a way that in some ways the biggest and most widespread opposition was in employers just refusing to dedicate more of their monthly budget to these women because they didn't value them, and I think sometimes saw them as exceptions to other Black people out in the world. There are these stories of, I mean, these are from Montgomery, but there are examples in Atlanta as well, where the bus boycott is happening, and people's individual employers are like, "I'm really glad you're not out there with them," but the woman working for them was out there, not taking the bus, and so I think that that's part of what I think is challenging in the work about organizing in the world of domestic labor is that the opposition comes through this language of love. That it's not always this outwardly hostile kind of opposition. And so, in some ways, I think that that's the biggest way that it was shown. That and really high expectations. That's the other thing that the kind of language of love undergirds. I don't, there's a really good nomination that talks about this where the employer writes in and says, I'm so grateful that this domestic worker takes care of my three dogs, my like 10 parakeets, my seven cats, my constant house guests. When we're gone, she like takes care of our like 10-bedroom house and people come in and out at any time and the beds are always. And so you read this and the employer is like, "Yeah, isn't it so great that this person is like keeping up with my insane, life?" And you read this as a historian, and I'm sure you live it as a domestic worker, you're like, this is way too much, right? And certainly way too much for what I'm getting paid. So I think that's the other way, um, that there was pushback, a refusal to expect a reasonable amount of work to get done in a given day.
Yeah, that's an insane amount of work for just one person. Like,
Yeah, I read that one and I was like, whew, I want to call this woman up and see if she got some rest, later in life or
yeah.
something. I felt so bad for her reading that nomination. So.
Oh wow. Yeah, no, I cannot imagine. So we have a couple of questions, kind of talking about kind of the civil rights movement through this. And so our first one of those is from Robert W. He says, "Great presentation. Your discussion of Maynard Jackson is really interesting. Can you talk a little more about Mayor Jackson's view on labor? At this time, he is opposing efforts by sanitation workers, another group of working class African Americans, to improve wages and working conditions."
Yeah, the question of Maynard, and not just him, but I think the kind of black male political class and their relationship to labor across the 70s is a really sad story. Um, what's interesting about Jackson is that I don't know the extent of this. I need to go find out, but certainly when the union starts, he's their lawyer, at least for a while. And in the late 60s and early 70s, I mean, Jackson is seen as a radical. I mean, of all the kind of black political elite of that moment, he's seen as the furthest to the left and the most amenable to really trying to broker peace between white businessmen who want to continue to politically run the city but have to let that dream go when Maynard gets elected, and the kind of black labor community. And so, in this period that I'm talking about in the talk, Jackson is still very friendly towards labor, but you're right. By 1977, not just him, but most of the black civil rights elite in Atlanta are against the sanitation workers in this strike. And certainly by the time Jackson gets reelected in the 90s, I mean, he has totally abandon his commitment to the labor part of the civil rights movement, um, kind of political, I don't know, ideology. And so I think the kind of path that Jackson takes, like I said, it maps on the path that others take. And I think the way that I would summarize that path is in the mid 20th century, um, or in the early 1960s, it is jobs and freedom, right? It is rights and labor. And I think King, he had a real skill at balancing the constituencies that both of those things represented. But when the chance to really hold political power opens up in Atlanta, but the compromise that has to be made is the economics, most of the black politicians make that compromise so that they can actually, essentially, so that they don't become Detroit, right? Where all the money leaves and they're left politically running a city that is, bereft. And so someone like Jackson is like looking around and is trying to avoid that in Atlanta. And the way that he does that is by sacrificing the labor part of the civil rights coalition in order to keep money coming into the city.
Yeah, no, I know the sanitation workers and asked me Local 1644, which we have the records for. It's a really amazing collection. I highly recommend it. It kind of tells the story of inspired by King leading the Memphis sanitation workers. Atlanta goes on strike, and they have this broad coalition of support. And then throughout the 70s, when they continue, to periodically go on strike to um, kind of protests like poor working conditions, poor wages, they're getting less and less support until in 77 with Mayor Jackson just shutting them down. It is a really interesting story. And so it was nice to see kind of those two, the National Domestic Worker Union, but also, our Black sanitation workers kind of have a intersection.
Yeah, that actually makes me think. The one thing I would add is that um, it really shows you the way the intra-racial class politics just broadly break down by 1980 because people like Bolden and like Ethel May Matthews, they stick with the sanitation workers all the way to the end. Um, and so, yeah, it just becomes a really clear class divide among Black activists in the city, for sure.
Yeah. 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 And the sanitation workers had a really hard time recovering from Mayor Jackson withholding his support. Um, Okay, our next question from Dalton is you are discussing, I think, the transition from informal power to more formal power for domestic workers, which is a long process. What linkages have you found between domestic workers and other civil rights, labor rights movements, like our Atlanta sanitation workers? Right? Are there similar dynamics in regards to expanding techniques? And are there similar movements in other parts of the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think one of the things that's a bit different about the domestic workers union is that they never become formal. And that really shapes their relationship to the rest of the labor movement. So when the union was first an idea in the late 60s, Bolden brought it to the AFL-CIO, and they were like, "We're not we're not interested. This is not, you don't have enough people. There's no real power here, whatever." She starts, her and a few other women start organizing and show that they can be a real base. And all of a sudden, the AFL-CIO, they come back and say, "Hey, can we help out? Do you guys want to be a union?" They're like, "We're already a union." Um, and so I think there was an opportunity there for the NDWU to join the kind of labor left coalition more formally, but that never fully happened. And so while Bolden had good relationships with some labor leaders, I think there was to the end a real distrust there, so that they never kind of fully joined um, these more formal coalitions. And so what I think would happen instead is that the NDWU became more of a more closely aligned with uh, the kind of organizing that kind of remains to this day is kind of informalized. I still haven't found the right language to describe that world, but it's the kind of it's that kind of welfare rights, um, activism framed around like being low income Black women. It's poverty rights activism, and so they kind of end up more in that strand of organizing that to me is still labor organizing, but to most people is not. And so I think that the kind of distrust between Bolden and other members of the union and the more formal labor movement kind of means they never fully converge. Though I think that that's maybe a little. Actually, you can almost see that dynamic further reinforced at the national level. So, in other places, especially in northern cities like New York and Cleveland, and Premilla Nadisin, in her book, she covers this really beautifully. Um, there's a kind of national um, movement for domestic worker rights, but it's telling that that movement is for just being included in the Federal Labor Standards Act, um, and is not able to get to the point to being able to actually organize under it. And that I would see them as closely aligned with something like the National Welfare Rights Organization. So again, a kind of attempt to get more integrated into that state regulated labor world, but real resistance on a number of levels to that happening, shaping the kind of informality of the organizing that happened.
Yeah, and I remember reading Dorothy Bolden saying one of the challenges they have compared to more traditional unions is that their employers are, widespread. There's only, one person per employer, while in traditional organizing, you have a concentration of workers. They're all in one place. They're really easy. They're not maybe easy, but like you can get to them. Meanwhile, she had to ride all of the bus lines in Atlanta to start organizing her fellow domestic workers.
Which I guess also connects back to one of the questions about what we can learn from the National Domestic Workers Union today, because they found an effective model for organizing people at far-flung workplaces, which is an issue a lot of labor organizations are now facing. And I think the strategy that she developed, well, I think there were two strategies. One that is harder to replicate, and the other that is maybe a little easier. The one that I think is harder to replicate is that Bolden, because she was a leader in a variety of communities, was able to recognize that these were women rooted in space, in neighborhoods, in churches. And so she really, I think, in bus lines. And so I think she was able to really approach her organizing almost as more of a community organizer. And so she was like, yes, I'm organizing domestic workers, but really I'm organizing communities of women who live in the same place. Um, and I'm sort of learning from that insight to say that's why we should think about all of these women as a cohort doing something together because they are in the same spaces. They go to the same meetings. They like know each other. I think the second piece that comes out of that, that's maybe a lesson that we could replicate today, is that Bolden was, I think, really trying to develop a language around what it meant to do caring labor that made other people's work possible and what it meant to be a low income Black woman doing that. That she was trying to create almost like a group identity and to explain why the people who fit into that identity did indispensable work. And I think that's a strategy that um, other people could take up. How do you help these workers who don't know each other develop a collective identity that then can help you to organize them as a group when they're not physically a group in a workplace?
Yeah, that's really interesting and a good takeaway for our activists now. In the last couple of minutes, I wanted to ask some questions about kind of your archival research. I know you're kind of early in the process with us here at the Southern Labor Archive, but have you found anything surprising or unexpected?
Yeah, I actually, so when I came to do research in person for the first time, I listened to the what's it called? The Georgia government documentary.
Yeah, yeah.
So I've listened to most of the interviews with Bolden, but I had never been able to get my hands on that one because I think it's only here like in
It is,
person.
yeah.
You have to come in and listen to it. And it was extraordinary. It was such a I don't know, they had caught her on like a really honest day. It is like the most frank I had heard her, and she's always pretty frank, but even franker than usual. I had heard her be in an interview and talking explicitly about what she thought about uh other political figures in the Atlanta world. So that was both kind of funny and really helpful. And the one that really stood out to me is that I'd always kind of wondered what her thoughts actually were on Jimmy Carter. And the interviewer asked her, he said, well, who was your favorite governor? Which in the context of her is kind of a leading question because we all know she spent the most time with She said, I don't have a favorite governor.
Oh,
She said, I don't like any of them. She said, but I did like Jimmy's mom. So I got my answer in that interview.
yeah. I think the interviewer was very much expecting a different answer.
Yeah, you could hear the silence. He said, "Oh," a long pause. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. Um, have you found kind of any other material in the archive that isn't quite right for this project, but could be a great future research project?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually, that's sort of how I feel about all the sanitation worker strike material.
Yeah.
I was really tempted to go down a whole rabbit hole um, that was just about that, and my committee was like, "Ashley, you have to mention it, but you can't you can't fully it has to be like a section in a chapter." So I would love to write more about the sanitation workers strike and what it meant for Atlanta politics and what it tells us about the class politics of Black politics and social life nationally. I mean, I think it says something to that broader story. Um, that I think books like James Forman's like Locking Up Our Own, I feel like have become the kind of centerpieces of thinking about conflict between middle class and working class um, Black interests. Around that the carceral state has become the like main way of thinking about that. And I think the what happened with the sanitation workers here could absolutely speak to that national story in a different kind of way, which I think would be really exciting. So
Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing this future project from you.
me too, and I'll get to come back to the beautiful reading room here. So that's always a
Yeah.
plus.
Yeah. Well, I could keep talking to you for a very long time, but we should probably wrap up. If anyone is interested in learning more about the National Domestic Workers Union, the collection is fully digitized and available online through our digital collections, which you can access via our library website, library.gsu.edu, under the Special Collections tab. And if you're interested in learning more about the sanitation workers here in Atlanta, you can also find those in archive space. And it has not been digitized. I think it would be an excellent collection to do so maybe sometime down the line. And it is Ask Me Local 1644. Uh, and so I want to thank you so much, Eshe, for such a great presentation. It was really interesting. I think we all have learned so much and look forward to seeing your dissertation.
Me
Uh,
too.
And if you are interested in applying for our 2022 Read Fink Award and using the Southern Labor Archives for your research, applications are now open and you can access it via our library website, library.gsu.edu under special collections. Applications close on September 15th. And so I look forward to seeing our next round of applicants and the diverse research that people are using for the Southern Labor Archives.